I think we all know that our social environment is increasingly embedded. Can you hear me well, actually? Okay. Is increasingly embedded with algorithmic devices that collect users' data, analyze them in real time, and render them into knowledge, which is predominantly manifested by some kind of action, for example, recommendations. And we experience algorithmic devices as mostly as personal because they are consumed through private devices and they very much cater to our personal needs. But their effects are also social and political, and we can increasingly see algorithmic systems taking part in governance. So platforms such as Waze and Move It, and we'll just use it as an example, are increasingly used by government agencies such as municipalities. And such agencies describe the algorithmization of governance, usually in neutral terms of efficacy, pointing mostly to the ability of these devices to offer new and hitherto inaccessible knowledge about the world. My argument, however, is that algorithms cannot be seen merely as technical devices that aid in decision-making, but that underlying them is a particular political conception of governance. So I'd like to think about algorithmic governance as a form of political imagination of the hegemon, or kind of a very hegemonic voice, but also critically evaluate the political ramification of that idea. And my critical intervention would be to argue that algorithmic governance is imagining a form of social order which turns political problems and processes into technical ones. And I mean, this theoretical idea of technology as ideology has been with us for a few decades, but I'd like to sort of bring it up to speed to our contemporary context. So I'll dive right into that. What I find particularly interesting about algorithmic governance as political imagination is a kind of paradox between how it promises to take into account individual will and how it actually excludes this will. And of course, this contradiction depends on how individual will is defined. So algorithms promise to make governance much more attuned to what people want. And let me sort of take a little intermission to explain what I mean by algorithms. So three things. So first of all, I mean a sort of a whole social technical system, which includes not only the actual algorithms, but technologies and agencies and professionals, users, etc. I call it algorithms as a shorthand because I look at these systems predominantly as epistemic devices, machines that are geared to translate big data into knowledge. And this is done by algorithms. And what I would, my basic assumption is that they're not simply doing it more efficiently, but differently. They offer a new way to know the world. And the third point that I want to make generally about algorithms is I limit my discussion to what I call interface algorithms, which have two important characteristics. They are weaved into the daily life of individuals. So, for example, I'm excluding the use of algorithmic devices in the sciences. And second, what they present to individuals, and I kind of said it already, is not primarily the knowledge they create about them, but some byproduct informed by this knowledge. So recommendation engines, they don't really tell you what they think your taste is in music or movies. They just offer you a movie based on that. So going back to what I described as kind of a populist promise of algorithmic governance, to understand it, we need to consider the data or the ontology of data on which it operates, which is usually called user-generated. But that's kind of a misnomer. It's not predominantly generated by willing subjects. Instead, it's automatically emerging by us simply existing objectively in a digital world. So such data is, in a way, the closest empirical manifestation of the ideal type of life in the sense of Lazarat or Agamben, something really strict of social structures, I would say. And just living and breathing and moving and watching in this environment creates data. So the idea is that algorithmic decision-making devices supposedly render what people do into knowledge about what people want. And this distinction is important because when you are getting recommendations from Netflix, it doesn't simply give you, what you've already watched that would be redundant. Rather, it renders what you have watched and many more variables, such as the time you watched it, what movies you watched before this movie, how many pauses you've made during watching, the TV series or whatever. Netflix renders it into what you'd want to watch. So it's deciphering, in fact, your taste and preferences. So with this objective data, they presumably refer to something more subjective or internal about who you are. So the political imagination offered by algorithms is that you can govern by taking into account those kind of feedback loops from reality, in this case, the will of individuals. So I would call it a kind of populist or democratic assumption. It's not just a kind of a top-down decision of what you're going to watch, but it's based on your own will. Or if you think about smart cities, which is a good example of algorithmic governance, you can imagine, for example, municipalities making political decisions based on algorithmic systems, assuming such systems already include public will. And we don't really need to even imagine that this is already happening if we consider platforms such as Move It. I don't know if everyone is familiar with it, a navigation app for public transport. And Move It, for example, and I'm really just using it as an example, is, presumably it's geared to help individual users to move around, right? It's really about what you want to do and how it can help you. But it is also another thing. It is a data collection center. The essence of this machine is creating a living data set, incessantly updating, and which will be able to govern the city. We can start, I think, to grasp the political ramification of something like Move It if we consider its political economy. The customers of Move It, quote unquote customers, are certainly not the end users, us using it, the device. If anything, these are the workers who supply the raw materials for the platform data. Move It has two entirely different customers, which actually become increasingly harder to distinguish in terms of governance or algorithmic governance. One is, it's not officially a customer, but in my terms, it would be. One is Mobileye, which is a subsidiary of Intel. Intel bought Move It in 2020 for close to $1 billion and put it under its subsidiary Mobileye. Why would Mobileye, which is a world leader in autonomous transportation technology, be interested in a public transport app? I think it's quite obvious that they're really interested in this treasure trove of data because they need to come up with a total transportation governance system for their main business. The other key customers of MoveIt are municipalities, which buy transportation data and knowledge in order to inform decision-making about urban matters. Now, what happens when a municipality is making a decision based on an algorithmic system is that, as I said, presumably they're taking into account the will of the people, how, for example, how people actually use the transport system, how they move around in the city. But as I said, this is assumed, I'm sorry, these systems, register what people do, but as I said, this is assumed as a proxy for what people want. But something which was particularly important for modern politics is missing here. And as a shorthand, I recall it subjectivity, which is the distance between what we do and who we are. Subjectivity helps us think about something like will as much more complex and even contradictory. It assumes a multiplicity even behind something as simple as I want, right? There's I and me and self and the future self and the imagined self, etc. Subjectivity is the realm where this complexity plays out through self-reflection, which allows us, for example, to want something and at the same time critique that wants. So we can think of subjectivity as a historical project which allowed expanding our political horizons. What algorithmic governance does is take out this subjective as well as intersubjective, but I'm not getting into that, this subjective process of self-reflection, which is done through natural language, where one doesn't merely act, but also has sort of a meta-action of judgment upon this act. Algorithms have a much more monolithic, even sort of behaviorist conception of human beings. People are what people do. And this is another important point. Subjectivity is obviously a utopian assumption of a free society. This is an Enlightenment ideal, and it applies to almost all realms of life. So my basic idea is that, when we think about modernist institutions like markets, the law, and even love and relationship, we assume that there is a free subject there that is actually able to get into, for example, into contract with other people. That's our notion of freedom. Doesn't mean that it exists, but it's kind of a, let's say, a utopian horizon. And it obviously applies also to politics. Politics in a free society assumes a utopian horizon where we, as individuals and as a public, form an authentic and autonomous political will. Only under these conditions can we talk about politics as a form of freedom. And the only expression of political will and of freedom is the very act of reflectively expressing one's will and being responsible for that will. I mean, that's very much an Enlightenment idea. What algorithmic governance imagines is a kind of post-Enlightenment social order where subjectivity can be left behind without losing individuality. Indeed, our current technological environment consecrates the individual. It's all about personalization, but at the same time, it wishes to do away with subjectivity. Algorithmic governance then still reflects the will of individuals, but no longer as subjects capable of making their own decisions based not only on their immediate actions or reactions, but based also on a second order, kind of a reasoned reflection on that action. And this is what we call critical knowledge, to know ourselves critically. Now, the notion of subjectivity as a realm of human emancipation can, of course, be met with a sort of post-Enlightenment critique from those who see subjectivity primarily as a realm of discipline, as governmentality, which is formed under the pressure of coercive power relations or structures. In other words, we were never modern and we're never approaching a teleology of emancipation. Subjectivity is merely a more sophisticated and sinister form of social control. According to this, let's say, Foucauldian logic, in the digital context, we should therefore think about the formation of an algorithmic subject or a digital subject and link it, for example, with the neoliberal constellation. But I want to make a little twist on that, because if we follow this logic, we should actually wonder whether we should be talking about the formation of a new subjectivity or something radically different, which is the undoing of subjectivity as such. Whereas during modernity, governments required the formation of subjects and the cooperation, algorithmic governance make governmentality redundant. Subjectivity was required in order to mobilize individuals into social processes. We just heard, for example, or an example with fear. You needed a real subject to have this fear. At the same time, subjectivity could also be a site of resistance and change. So quite similarly to Enlightenment thinkers, Foucault too sees subjectivity not merely as an object of power, but also as a site of possible emancipation. There is another parallel of Foucault with Enlightenment thinking about subjectivity, which I didn't really talk about actually. He too locates knowledge, self-knowledge, at the heart of subjectivity. So the interest may be disciplining rather than emancipation, but underlying it is a similar dictum, know thyself. So even according to the Foucauldian measure, what algorithms do is to shortcut the process of self-formation through self-knowledge. Algorithms usurp the conduct of conduct from the subject. If subjectivity is the locus for constellation of conceptions, feelings, and wants which inform us how to behave, then the entrance of algorithms which sort of form our conduct, or conduct our conduct rather, from the outside makes subjectivity redundant, certainly redundant as a political project. So even if we follow this post-Enlightenment line of thought, we may still conclude that algorithms undermine subjectivity. They are becoming a new agent which governs life without even the need for subjectivity. Under such conditions, should we still be speaking about the creation of an algorithmic subject? Is it not more accurate to see the effects of algorithms as creating objects? Itai, do I have a few more minutes? Or so?
Your time is officially up, but you can have 2 more minutes if you need.
No, yeah, just to wrap it up.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the political ramifications of that are troubling, and here I follow scholars who point to the way by which algorithms demand a new form of sovereignty in the context, even in the context of open democratic societies, by taking decisions which are virtually impossible to audit and critique because they are legally and technologically opaque, constantly mutating, and perhaps most crucially, they are formed in a natural language. So we might know that some decision was taken based on this algorithmic analysis, but it's very, very hard to actually rise to the level of actually speaking about it politically or talk to each other about it. Yeah, I think I'll stop here.